Good afternoon and welcome to City Club of Portland Friday Forum. I am John Horvick, President-elect of City Club, and would like to welcome members and guests alike. Those of you who join us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today, State Treasurer Ted Wheeler will discuss how Oregonians can work together to build a better state. But first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and our Friday Forum corporate spring sponsors, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Schwabe, Williamson & Wyatt. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. I'd also like to recognize that here today is Shane Bemis, Mayor of Gresham. Welcome, Mayor. We're grateful to have you in the audience today. Join us next week for discussion and debate and vote on whether City Club should recommend a vote for or against fluoridation of the public water supply in Portland. The forum is open to everyone, but you must be a current City Club member to debate and cast a vote. City Club membership is open to everyone. Tickets are now on sale for our upcoming Civic Salon series, where our provocateurs will discuss the future of Portland. Our Civic Salons bring together people for enjoyment, education, and the exchange of ideas, complete with good food and good drink. You can learn more about club events, purchase tickets, and become a member at our website, pdxcityclub.org. We'll be having a Q&A session with State Treasurer Ted Wheeler at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. And for all our audience participants, please locate the index cards at the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. We'll collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. And now to our program. The challenges facing Oregon today can seem daunting, but Oregonians have a long history of overcoming obstacles through a combination of creativity, perseverance, and collaboration. State Treasurer Ted Wheeler says Oregonians should reconnect with our pioneering roots, take calculated risks, and work together to build a better state. This means being unafraid to blaze new trails when it comes to building a strong workforce for the jobs of tomorrow, making economic development efforts more nimble, and financing key infrastructure to bolster Oregon's long-term competitiveness. As sixth-generation Oregonian, Ted Wheeler cares deeply about Oregon and the state's financial health. He is committed to protecting the state's current strong credit ratings, to ensuring that public investments remain both prudent and profitable, and to conservatively managing Oregon's debt. He believes all Oregonians will be able to stand taller because their state is on stable financial footing. And so without further ado, please help me welcome State Treasurer Ted Wheeler.
Good afternoon. As you've just heard, I'm a sixth-generation Oregonian, and I say that only by way of reinforcing an important point, which is that I'm very proud of Oregon's histories and traditions. But I also believe this to be true. Whether your family came generations ago on a covered wagon, or whether you just came yesterday in a U-Haul truck, I believe all of us have something very powerful in common. What we have in common is a sense of unbridled enthusiasm and hopeful optimism for Oregon's future. All of us have a stake in that future, but more importantly, together, all of us have an obligation to help shape that future. When my ancestors decided to head to Oregon in 1852, they had to make some hard choices. They took calculated risks. They had to decide, was it worth it to come to Oregon? Should they leave their extended family and friends behind? Should they leave their vocations? Should they risk their very lives to come and be part of what at that time was the promise of Oregon? I would venture to guess that that's true about everyone in this room and everybody listening on the radio. Every one of us or our ancestors made calculated choices. And through varying circumstances, we all found ourselves here together as part of the Oregon experience. None of us can really say what the future of Oregon holds. And my remarks today aren't really intended to be so much about the history of our state as the future of our state and what sort of legacy we're going to leave for future generations. For my own part, I'll just tell you flat out, I'm optimistic. I see a future bounded on one hand by nearly limitless opportunity, but to be frank, I see that future bounded on the other hand by some very daunting challenges. To see those opportunities and challenges played out in real politic, one only need look 60 miles to the south in Salem, where the Oregon legislature is currently in session. The decisions made by the legislature in the coming days and weeks will be very important because they'll determine how much of that potential we can realize and how many of those challenges we'll have the courage to face. It's the middle of the session. This is a very fragile time. Much hangs in the balance. The education, the well-being, the safety, the livability of our communities, and the security of our citizens. All of the promise that she affords to us and to future generations hangs in the balance. The Oregon Treasury is, to my thinking, a very important part of that legislative process. We have offered and we're making the case for the best ideas we can think of that we believe will help ensure a vibrant and successful future for Oregon and its citizens. I'm going to focus the majority of my remarks today on one of those best ideas. It has to do with higher education and job training in Oregon. Much of the discussion in recent years around our economy has been focused on how do we bring jobs to Oregonians. Our idea, the Oregon Opportunity Initiative, flips that frame and asks the question differently. How do we bring Oregonians to the jobs? I'll talk about that in more detail later. I believe we're at a point in Oregon history where we have some stark choices before us. Stagnation or prosperity. Doing business as usual and accepting the status quo, or innovating and challenging conventional wisdom. Do we seek to push off problems to future generations, or do we have the courage to address those problems head on today and experience whatever circumstances might result? Those are the questions. But the good news is, whatever we decide to do, the choice is entirely ours. As your treasurer, I want to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I want to thank everybody who's here in the room in the Governor Hotel. I want to especially acknowledge my lovely wife, Katrina. It's not that often I get to say that she paid to hear me speak, although I know she's probably here for the dessert. I'd like to thank our listeners on OPB Radio. A special shout out to all of you. And I'd like to thank the club members and the board members of the City Club for extending the opportunity for me to speak. The City Club is one of Oregon's preeminent forums. It's where people come to share big ideas and visions for Oregon's future. I appreciate this opportunity to have a conversation with Oregonians on some fairly weighty issues. I also appreciate it because, frankly, the best ideas aren't here in my head. Katrina would readily attest to that. This may shock some people, but the best ideas aren't in Salem in the legislature either. No, the best ideas are out there. The best ideas that we get in Oregon come from the fields, the farms, they come from the shorelines, they come from the cities and towns all across the state of Oregon. That's where we get the best ideas. So I'm just grateful to help exchange a couple of ideas today. The title assigned to my remarks today is Building a Better Oregon. That's a very broad subject. Remember this, no matter what we choose to do, no matter what the topic, conventional thinking can be a trap. It can be a barrier that prevents us from doing the things that we need to do to move Oregon forward. So how do we build a better Oregon? As I said, I'm going to focus the majority of my remarks on the Oregon Opportunity Initiative, which I'm going to lay out in a couple of minutes. But I want to acknowledge that building a better Oregon could encompass a whole host of topics: health and the security of our citizens, how to fund our education system and get the results we need. We could talk about regulation. We could talk about the environment. We could talk about our pension system. We could talk about our dysfunctional revenue structure. We could talk about how to ensure an open, free, and civil society. And yes, we could talk about the challenges and the opportunities of changing demographics in our state, and many other important topics to boot. Obviously, if I tried to tackle all of these topics, we'd need to order pizza in for our dinner and a lot of coffee. Over the last 6 years, however, there's one subject more than any other that's dominated the headlines, the policy debates, and the water cooler discussions around the state of Oregon. It's the one subject that I believe is most directly linked to Oregon's future prosperity or lack thereof. That's the question of how do we grow our economy? How do we ensure the economic self-sufficiency of our citizens? How do we ensure the economic vitality and prosperity of our communities across this state? Folks, I think everybody understands that there's some good things that are happening in our economy. We're seeing strength in housing. There's a lot of exciting things going on in manufacturing. Intel just completed the multi-billion-dollar DX1 or D1X, I believe it is, facility out in Hillsborough. We're seeing a lot of exciting things happening around entrepreneurship, innovation, and technology growth here in the state of Oregon. And those are good things, and we should all be proud of them. But the reality is, structurally, we still have problems in our economy. Unemployment remains high. We're still lagging the rest of the nation when it comes to per capita wage growth. Poverty is growing in this state at a rate that I think is unacceptable, and I'm sure you agree. Did you know that there are 660,000 Oregonians living below the federal poverty line? Today, nearly 1 out of every 4 children live in poverty. We understand that this is not our great-grandparents' economy. We understand that this is not our great-grandparents' Oregon. It can't be. The promise of Oregon has to be grounded in the realities of today, and it has to look to the future. I want to give you 2 examples to illustrate that point prior to our conversation about the Oregon Opportunity Initiative. Shortly after I was elected Multnomah County Chair in 2006, I had the pleasure of taking a boat ride up the Willamette River and under the Selwood Bridge. A fellow elected leader from a different jurisdiction pointed at a big chunk of concrete falling off the bottom of one of the columns, and he turned to me and he said, "Ted, that's Multnomah County's biggest infrastructure problem." And I remember thinking at the time, what do you mean that's Multnomah County's problem? That's our problem. It's all of our problem. I remember thinking at the time, where did this conventional wisdom come from, that the problem of the Selwood Bridge should be assigned exclusively to Multnomah County? After all, the bridge was located in the city of Portland, and it was regional transportation infrastructure. People from all over the region commuted over it and received goods and services through transportation provided by that facility. The Corps of Discovery, when they landed on the Oregon coast, they didn't just tell each of the members of their party to go and build a small cottage. They worked together. They built Fort Clatsop, and then they worked together to build additional dwellings. Similarly, I don't think Oregonians today believe that individual cities or counties or school districts or water districts or anything else should be solely responsible for going it alone to build vital infrastructure that's critical to the underpinnings of our economy. We need to build infrastructure. Big stuff like roads and bridges and airports and seaports and rail mobility that's so critical to our traded sector economy. But small stuff too, like basic water and sewer projects that are all too often the choking off point for economic development in communities all across this state. The question of infrastructure has been around forever, but it's getting harder and harder to finance and to build. All you need to do to confirm this is take a look at the condition of our roads, take a look at the condition of our bridges, take a look at the condition of our school facilities all around this state. I'm told there are still water mains in the state of Oregon that are made out of wood. Now that's very Oregon. I'm just not sure I want to make that the basis of our future economic prosperity. Conventional wisdom in Oregon has long dictated that the way you build infrastructure is you build it one project at a time on a case-by-case basis. As such, each project is a custom project. Generally speaking, there's very little learning from one project to the next in terms of how we do it right. Each project has its own design, its own procurement process, its own financing structure and relationships, its own construction and management processes. Each project is typically the responsibility of one jurisdiction that's assigned that responsibility, and how that project gets assigned to a jurisdiction often makes no logical sense whatsoever. Again, I would go back to the example of the Selwood Bridge. The hard truth is this: the conventional wisdom in Oregon about how we build and how we maintain infrastructure is fundamentally flawed. It's wrong. We succeeded with the Selwood Bridge, and I want to thank all of the jurisdictions who came together to challenge the conventional wisdom. Multnomah County, the City of Portland, Metro, the state, former Clackamas County Chairwoman Lynn Peterson, and former Mayor Sam Adams. We challenged conventional wisdom, and look what's going on today. There are many infrastructure projects in the state of Oregon, however, that aren't moving forward. Many of those projects are on the state's economic development critical path, and they're assigned to jurisdictions that have neither the financial capacity nor the technical expertise to get those projects done. And here's the big surprise: they will probably never have either of those things. The way we build infrastructure in Oregon is too inefficient, too costly, too lacking in consistent technical expertise. Moreover, we all too often miss out on the opportunity to get worthy projects constructed. That's why we in the Treasury, with our partners in the states of California and Washington, in addition to Oregon and British Columbia, are disposing with conventional wisdom. Instead, what we're doing is we're creating what's called the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange. It's being managed out of my office in partnership with Governor John Kitzhaber. I want to publicly thank the Rockefeller Foundation for financing all of the work to date that's gone into how we structure this and how we operate this exchange. Just launched in November, it'll help make vital projects more feasible through pooling of similar local projects, connecting governments with the technical expertise they need to get the projects done, and connecting those projects with global investors that we already use as partners in our various state and provincial treasuries. It may come as a surprise to many people to learn that Oregon actually invests hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure projects in places like China, in places like Brazil. That's part of managing our state's global investment portfolio. We look for good opportunities around the globe. But I believe Oregonians want us to invest more of Oregon's money in Oregon infrastructure projects where it makes sense to do so. The West Coast Infrastructure Exchange makes it far more likely that we'll be able to do that in the future. Another thing we're doing differently in the Treasury is looking at how we can manage the state's money more effectively and how we can manage it better. The long-standing conventional wisdom in the state of Oregon has been for many years that we can't hire significantly more professionals in-house in order to manage those services. That's mostly as a result of resource shortages and long-standing budgetary policy in Salem. The net result is that we now spend hundreds of millions of dollars on outsourced management. Don't get me wrong. We need to hire the best expertise we can get to manage this very complex portfolio, and there are a lot of good people outside the state of Oregon who help us to do that. But there is more work that we could do in-house here in Oregon rather than sending the money to Wall Street and paying a premium to do it. I don't think Oregonians want us to send jobs to Wall Street when we can keep them here in Oregon and save a lot of money in the process. Let me be more specific. We've put a proposal in front of the legislature. It's wrapped up in a bill called Senate Bill 120 that calls for us to insource a number of positions from Wall Street, predominantly. These aren't positions that are particularly high-paid positions. They're what most people would consider back office risk mitigation positions, positions like fund accountants, internal auditors, analysts, risk managers, and the like. We have demonstrated that if we can bring those positions back in-house, bring them back here to Oregon where we know we can fill them with qualified people, we can save somewhere in excess of $14 million per year. More jobs here, more income growth here, saving money. Sounds like a pretty good idea. We had a consultant who actually took a broader view, and they came to the conclusion if we insourced even more positions, we could save up to $90 million a year. At a time when people are talking about this huge unfunded PERS liability, think about this. Think about what $90 million a year amortized over 20 years would do in terms of reducing that unfunded liability in the pension system. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting we could necessarily get those returns. Those are based on a consultant's report, and we all know that those are subject to change and to some interpretation. But the basic point is this. We can do things just as well, if not better, in the state of Oregon and save a lot of money in the process under Senate Bill 120, so why wouldn't we do it? I'm going to focus the remainder of my remarks on the third thing I want to talk about today, which I mentioned up front, which is the Oregon Opportunity Initiative. I'd like you to think for just a moment about a child that means a lot to you. It could be your child. It could be your grandchild. It could be the kindergartner who lives across the street. I want you to ask yourself a real question and a tough question. Do you think that child has the same opportunity that you did to achieve what you have achieved in life up to this point? That's the question I want you to hold in your mind for a moment. We all know that a quality education is the key to a young person's success. And we know that education and training beyond high school is a very important part of that overall educational process. If you agree with me that the economy and economic growth is the most important long-term issue confronting the state of Oregon, we already know that education is one of the things that we can do to help ensure that economic growth. And we already know that higher education and vocational training are key components of that. Now, I don't like to throw out a lot of statistics at these lunches. I don't want anybody to choke. But there are some statistics that I think warrant repeating. The first is this: despite everything you have heard in terms of conventional wisdom about the value of higher education not really being there and the value of job training being somewhat ethereal, the fact is this: there is a huge disparity in terms of lifelong income earnings from those who have post-secondary education versus those who do not. Studies show that over a lifetime of earning, somebody with a college degree can earn anywhere from $280,000 to $800,000 more than somebody who just has a high school diploma. Moreover, during this recession, unemployment rates for people without college degrees were drastically higher than those who did have college degrees, 9% versus 5%. The reason I mention these statistics is because that disparity, though large today, is only expected to grow with time. It's expected to grow with time because jobs will demand higher skills and more training in the future than they do today. Another statistic that's important: the Georgetown University Center for Education and Workforce recently released a study where they predicted that by the year 2018, 65% of the jobs in the United States of America would require some level of post-secondary education or training. 65%. So go back to that child I asked you to put in your mind and ask yourself, as I continue my remarks, how well prepared do you think Oregon is for that future economy? Consider the plight of Oregon students in our universities and community colleges. They're struggling under the status quo. The costs they and their families are paying for that education are rising at a meteoric pace. Just between the years 2004 and 2012, the cost of higher education in the state of Oregon, in the Oregon university system, went up by 50%. The debt that they and their families are incurring is also going up at a very drastic pace, 21% in just a 5-year period. I think you've all heard that nationally that debt now amounts to over $1 trillion. That's greater than the total personal credit card debt outstanding. And as if that's not bad enough, this whole problem is exacerbated by an anemic student aid program here in the state of Oregon. Every state has some form of student aid for low and middle income students. We do too. In Oregon, it's called the Oregon Opportunity Grant Program. The Oregon Opportunity Grant Program is based, as I say, on need. It's very well intended, but the fact is it's woefully underfunded and it's inconsistently funded over time. Meaning if you have one of those grants your freshman and sophomore year, there's no guarantee that you'll have the grant junior year or senior year. And I fear that students may be forced to drop out as a result. So even though the Oregonian identified the Oregon Opportunity Grant Program as the 45th most generous in the United States, most people can't really wrap their arms around it. What do you mean that it's not generous? I want to illustrate this point with sort of a lighthearted example. For those of you on the radio, I'll illustrate the point. We're in a ballroom full of people. Let's assume this ballroom full of people are all low-income Oregon students. All of you need that post-secondary education or training in order to get into whatever job might be available to you once you graduate. But there's a problem, and we're going to illustrate it in this way. You're all sitting at tables that for the most part have 10 people sitting around them. Did you notice there's only 2 desserts? Which 2 of you got the dessert? And more importantly, which 8 of you get no dessert? Now, if you're irritated now, imagine this. And by the way, we're not that. Bill Dickey got the dessert at his table. Couldn't go to a better guy, I always say. here's the deal. And by the way, we're not that mean. Desserts are going to be brought out for the rest of you. But it illustrates a more serious point. If you're irritated because you didn't get a dessert, imagine this. Only 2 out of every 10 students who needs and qualifies and applies for the Oregon Opportunity Grant Program gets any money at all. 2 out of 10. The other 8 get nothing. They get nothing. And the 2 who do get something, they get a very small amount. They get about $2,000 per year. If you have kids in college today, you know that that's not very much. But this isn't just about student access. We're working hard to build an economic base in Oregon to create and sustain jobs. Wouldn't it be just crazy if all those jobs we created, if they couldn't fill them with Oregonians? Wouldn't that be just nuts? Well, the fact is, Oregon employers are also struggling under the status quo. There's a lot of jobs in this state that are going unfilled by Oregonians, even though we have a relatively high unemployment rate. We heard testimony related to the Oregon Opportunity Initiative where a high technology entrepreneur came in and said he had 4 very good paying jobs, very well paying jobs, and he'd been unable to fill them for 6 months. So he wanted to hire Oregonians, couldn't find people who were qualified, so he's opened the door to out-of-staters. Similarly, we heard stories about a meeting of high-tech entrepreneurs. There were 20 or 25 in a room. They went around the room and informally counted how many jobs they had open amongst all of them that they could not fill. Over 100 jobs with an average salary of $60,000 each. Not all of those jobs required a degree. A lot of them just required some degree of technical training. Now, if you're a skeptic, you'll say, okay, well, that's high technology related to software, and there's a lot of demand right now, and the skills are sort of unusual. Please understand this and bring this into your thinking about conventional wisdom. We went all over the state. We went corner to corner. We talked to manufacturers. We talked to healthcare concerns. We talked to technology companies. And in every one of those areas where we looked, we heard the same thing from employers. We've got the jobs. We just don't have the people being brought to the jobs with the right education and skills to connect them with those jobs. This is no way to suggest that we're not supportive of liberal arts. I myself am a liberal arts major. We'll always need people who understand the finer points of Herodotus and Thucydides and Xenophon and who can relate those points to today's leadership issues. It's still important, but the reality is if we're going to continue to work hard to create and sustain jobs, then we need to work just as hard to skill our workforce in a consistent manner with those jobs that are available. Not doing so, I believe, is not only bad public policy, it feels immoral to me. It feels like misrepresentation to me. So what is the Oregon Opportunity Initiative? Let's dig down a little deeper. The Oregon Opportunity Initiative makes higher education and job training more accessible and affordable to Oregonians. It has 3 goals. The first is to decrease the cost to Oregon students and their families. It has a second goal of reducing student debt, and it has a third goal of providing or making available the tools and training that would help connect Oregonians to the kinds of jobs that exist today in our workforce and that people expect will exist in the workforce in the future. It accomplishes these goals by creating a permanent, growing, sustainable endowment dedicated specifically to student aid. The endowment, once seeded, would be invested in a diversified, risk-managed portfolio very similar to the Common School Fund and other portfolios that are currently managed by the Oregon State Treasury. The income growth in the fund would be dedicated to student aid. The student aid would be available to 4-year university students. It would be available to 2-year community college students. And the legislation, the Oregon Opportunity Initiative legislation, has as an important goal increasing the number of vocational and technical training programs that are available in the state of Oregon. The recommended financing strategy for the Opportunity Initiative has an outcome such that 1 year after the program is established, the funds available for student aid will increase by about 50%. I want to make a couple of things very clear up front. First of all, this is a shared responsibility model. This is not a free ride. It's nothing close to it. It would still be on a needs basis as we envision it. Families would still be required to contribute to their children's or their own higher education experience to the degree that they're able to support it. The Oregon Opportunity Initiative is also open to changes. It creates a structure for financing, and it suggests the creation of a pool of financing, but it leaves the door wide open to refinements or improvements of how opportunity grants are actually distributed. This may sound rather grandiose, but I want to assure you that the Opportunity Initiative is very much grounded in reality. And one of those realities is that not everybody needs to and not everybody wants to attend a college or a university. There's a lot of people out there who want to work with their hands. They want the right skill set. And there's a lot of employers, as I said, who don't necessarily need people with fancy degrees. They need people with the right skills. They need to walk in the door ready to do what needs to be done. There's great examples of how this vocational training could work. I want to just quickly identify three. Blount Industries has a partnership in metalworking with Clackamas Community College. That's a very successful partnership and a transition for many young people and people skilling up who are adults into a lucrative field. The second is at Lynn Benton Community College, where they have an automotive tech program in conjunction with a private sector partner in Lebanon, where the mill jobs aren't as plentiful as they used to be. And finally, Columbia Gorge Community College has an excellent tech training program with Google. You know, these server farms, people need to be able to support and repair and keep running all of those servers. You don't necessarily need a college degree to do that, but you obviously need some level of technical training. And Google is working with the Columbia Gorge Community College to help create such a program. So we have incentives going towards trying to expand those opportunities. The legislation specifically calls out incentives to take a look at and consider critical degree programs in the state of Oregon. And yes, it also includes a request to look at how we could integrate STEM training, science, technology, engineering, and math, into our higher education universe. So the idea of a permanent fund for higher education sounds great, Ted, and I'm with you. Where are you going to get the money? All right, some of you have been thinking about that. Where exactly are you going to get the money to seed this grandiose idea? Well, there are several options that we have looked at, and there's several options that are still on the table. And I want to be very clear that I am open to any and all of those options. We haven't married any particular option. There is one option, however, that I'm really intrigued by, and it's the one that's most attached to the Oregon Opportunity Initiative up to this point, and that's the route of issuing general obligation bonds. Why issue general obligation bonds to seed this endowment? Well, the answer is a pragmatic one. We have the capacity, and it takes advantage of an artificially low interest rate environment that helps give us benefits in the long run that are significantly in excess of the costs that we would be incurring. The bonds would be issued at relatively low interest rates. The proceeds would be invested in that diversified risk-managed fund, and some percentage would go out towards the Opportunity Grant Program. The remainder would stay in the corpus of the fund and grow with time. This is a new use of general obligation bonds, but it's not a new or radical use of this investment strategy. This is a strategy that's been used for a long time. Now, some people might have concerns about this. Some might say, well, does the math add up? I want to assure you it does. We used very conservative assumptions in our modeling. We assumed that we would issue the bonds at an interest rate higher, much higher actually than what we're currently getting for taxable bonds, and we assumed that the investment portfolio would return a full third less over 30 years than what we've derived in our investment portfolio over the last 30 years. How much does it cost? Let's use a big number. Let's assume we issued $500 million in general obligation bonds, which, by the way, is a lot less than the amount of general obligation bonds we've issued over the last 30 years for prisons in Oregon. But let's assume we want to change our economic development from the use of those bonds for predominantly new prison facilities, and we want to invest instead in higher education access and affordability and job training, which personally I think is a comparatively good economic development strategy. Using our modeling over a 30-year period, the cost would be approximately $900 million. Cost about $30 million a year to service those bonds. At the end of 30 years, what do we get as Oregonians? We would end up with over $900 million in opportunity grants, and we would end up with over $800 million in a permanent endowment that will continue to grow into perpetuity. In other words, our $900 million begets $1.7 billion in value, even using conservative investment assumptions. Others might say, well, Ted, that sounds nice, but you yourself have said that general obligation bonds should only be used for things that are hard infrastructure, things like bridges, things like buildings. That's true. I used to say that. That's the conventional wisdom. So what I'm asking Oregonians to consider is think differently about what it means to build something of lasting value that serves our citizens for generations to come. I personally would argue that creating a permanent growing endowment is every bit as real as building a building or a bridge. The only difference is those crumble with time, the endowment grows with time. So I'm just asking people to think more broadly about it. Last but not least, some people say it targets the wrong problem. What about the cost of higher education? We looked at the data. Conventional wisdom is that the real problem isn't student aid, the problem is the cost per student. We looked at the data, it's available on our website, and what it shows you is that over the last 30 years in the state of Oregon, the cost per student of higher education in this state has remained relatively constant, accounting for inflation. What's changed is who bears the burden. As the legislature reduced funding for higher education, universities, being rational economic actors, shifted the cost onto the backs of students and their families. The Oregon Opportunity Initiative directly reshifts that cost off the backs of students and their families and onto this permanent growing endowment fund. Think about that. In the future, it won't even compete with K through 12 expenditures. So I want to end here. And where here is 30 years in the future. Oregon is known for its commitment to higher education, training, and a world-class workforce. We have an endowment that backs that promise, that delivers on the opportunity that we can grasp right here today. It will be as permanent and as real and as iconic as our coastlines and our mountains, and it will have great symbolic value. It'll say to the entire world that Oregon cares about the economic well-being of its citizens and that Oregon cares about having a world-class workforce. It will be a true competitive advantage. If you believe, as I do, that Oregon's economy is the most important thing to keep our eye on the ball over the future, and if you believe, as I do, that post-secondary education and job training is critical, then you might also consider whether or not that education should only be available to the most affluent families. I most certainly do not. I think it should be available to all. If you believe those things, then you should join me in supporting the Oregon Opportunity Initiative. I hope that 30 years from now, a state treasurer will stand right here at the Portland City Club and explain how the state of Oregon challenged conventional wisdom and took calculated risks to create a robust opportunity fund that made Oregon an economic beacon. As I say, it's in our hands. Eventually, if this gets through the legislature, which I know it will with your support, it has to go to the voters. So at the end of the day, that question of stagnation or prosperity, of challenging the status quo or not, of addressing our problems or just pushing them down to future generations, at the end of the day, we get to answer that question. And I hope you'll join me in answering in the affirmative by contacting your legislators and supporting the Oregon Opportunity Initiative. Thank you. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you may have about this subject or anything else. Thank you.
Treasurer Wheeler, thank you for coming to City Club to challenge the conventional thinking here in Oregon. And now, if you have a written question in your index card, please hold it high so that City Club staff can collect it from you. The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from today's Friday Forum host, Rob Aldisert. Rob has practiced law for 20 years and has served as a managing partner at Perkins Coie. He recently chaired the club's PERS study committee and is leading the advocacy efforts for the study's recommendations. Rob?
Treasurer Wheeler, we can't talk about the financial health of Oregon without talking about PERS. And to your great credit, you went out front on PERS reform last year when you urged some changes to the system. You suggested capping the annual cost of living increases granted to retirees and eliminating the practice of paying out-of-state retirees extra benefits to cover Oregon income taxes, which they don't pay. The governor agreed with you and has urged similar reforms. Well, currently pending is Senate Bill 822, which has been approved and is now in the House, and it provides for some COLA decrease, depending on the amount of the benefits paid, and it postpones payments of employers of $350 million that are due this biennium and puts them into the future. Now, if you've been reading the accounts in the paper, the Democrats are calling this shared sacrifice. The Republicans are calling it PERS light. Are you satisfied with Senate Bill 822? Why or why not?
Rob, thank you for the question. And I hope you'll indulge me because I'm not going to give you a short answer to this question. First of all, I want to say this is a very important issue and it's very complex. As state treasurer, I want to be clear. I don't have any formal authority whatsoever over the structure of the pension plan or the benefits that are paid out in that plan. That's the purview of the governor, the legislature, the PERS board, and the collective bargaining process. I need to dig a little deeper, and I think I can do that because this is a City Club audience. There's two sources of, and I will get to your question, Rob, but I want to give a little bit of the context before I give my answer. There's two sources of funding for our pension system. The biggest source of funding is the investment returns we get in the pension portfolio, the PERS portfolio. It's a $60 billion diversified portfolio. I am directly responsible for that performance along with my colleagues in the Treasury and my colleagues on the Oregon Investment Council. The other 30% of funding in the pension system comes for what are called employer contribution rates. Those are rates that are charged to school districts and municipal and county governments and the like. Prior to 2007, the pension system was fully funded. In fact, I think in 2007 it was funded at about 107%. Then along came the crash on Wall Street in 2007, 2008, And what happened as our investment returns declined precipitously, in order to balance out the payments in the system, those employer rates had to go up to account for the lost returns in the portfolio. Those rates that are charged to school districts that compete directly head-to-head for funding in classrooms and basic government services that our citizens say they want and expect went up a lot. Starting on July 1st, I think they go up $900 million, and the PERS board estimates that they will continue to go up in the future. So I sent that letter that Rob referred to about a year ago to the PERS board with two concerns from my perspective as state treasurer. One was that we have an assumed rate of return in the portfolio that I believe is too high. I don't believe going forward we're going to get the same investment performance, at least in the near and medium term, that we've seen in the past. And I think that needs to be reflected in the actuarial underpinnings of PERS and the calculation of the PERS rates. But I had a second concern, and it really came to me as the former chair of Multnomah County, and that is that those rates were going up at such a great rate. They were basically cutting into those educational and basic government services I was concerned about. Now, here's where I get to answering Rob's question. If you reduce the assumed rate of return, as I'd requested, which I think is the prudent and the intellectually honest thing to do, what does that do to the PERS rates charged to those already strapped districts? It increases them even more. So here's an example where doing the right thing actually hurts us more in terms of how we've structured the portfolio. Mayor Bemis is shaking his head in affirmative agreement. So at that same time, that, Rob, is where I made my recommendations to the PERS board. I just felt intellectually it was kind of nasty for me to suggest a required change that only makes their life more difficult. So I put those ideas on the table. Getting directly to your answer, the legislature has tried to move in the right direction. They encompassed in their solution two of the recommendations that I asked a year ago that they evaluate, the COLA cap and the out-of-state payment issue. Now to the question of whether it's enough. The question of it's enough has nothing to do with the pension system. The question of is it enough is a question of can they balance their budget. So the bigger question for them at this point is how big do they want the state budget to be? And once we have a clearer understanding of what it is they want to spend, then we'll know whether or not it's enough. But the key answer for today is they're trying to move in the right direction. I do have to say, as state treasurer, I have expressed some concerns about the third provision in their package, which is deferring the payments into the pension system. That's something that we will need to disclose fully to the bond rating agencies. Personally, I don't think if you do it once, it will have a material impact on those ratings, but the bond agencies will need to be assured that this isn't the beginning of a slippery slope for the state of Oregon. We have always done our best to fully fund that pension system in accordance with the standards of the PERS board, and the rating agencies wouldn't want to see us move away from that financial discipline that we've been able to exercise in past years. Sorry for the long answer.
We'll now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a privilege of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, identify yourself as a club member. Please ask only one question, and please ask your question succinctly as possible. I will flash a question mark card, and if I do, it means wrap it up.
Hi, I'm Peter Fenner. I'm a member of City Club, and you've described a number of complex ways of raising money, bonds, and other very clever ideas. I have a suggestion for you, and I'd like to know what steps you might take to get this free money. Basically, as you know, we burn up about $40 to $50 million worth of roads, grind out the dust, breathe it in for studded tires. We could put a fee that would commensurate that, which would be about $400 per user. It'd be a user fee. If you want to grind up the roads, go ahead and do it. Can you tell me what you're doing to try and get that done instead of talking about $5 and $10 a tire taxes?
So the honest and straight answer is I'm doing absolutely nothing about it. That is not the primary interest of the Treasury. We don't have any policy initiatives related to it. But I do have a very strong opinion on this subject, and I'm going to share it to you. I myself drive over the mountains on a very frequent basis. I put a lot of time on my wheels, and I have non-metal studded tires. I've had non-metal studded tires, meaning they're, I don't know what the technical term is. They don't have studs, is my point. They're modern snow tires. See why I shouldn't even answer this question? Don't ask me how to change the oil either when we're the next guy. But here's the deal. The technology is already moving in a different direction. And those tires have a useful life of only, I think, 4 or 5 years max. And I believe in about 4 or 5 years, you won't even see metal-studded tires sold in the state of Oregon because, frankly, you don't need them. You don't need them. Now, I'm not saying I know everybody's circumstances and all the uses for studded tires, and I don't pretend to know. I'm just telling you, I think the days of metal-studded tires are numbered, and I would validate that simply by having anybody call up Les Schwab or call up American Tires and ask them what they're selling. And for the most part, what they're selling now are studless snow tires. And I'm telling you from my own experience, they're totally sufficient. I do have a four-wheel drive vehicle today, but before what I had was a two-wheel drive Ford Focus, and it worked just fine going over the mountain passes with studless modern snow tires. Yes, sir.
My name is Gerald Fox. I'm a member of City Club. Treasurer Wheeler, the funding plan for the Columbia River crossing calls for the cost to be divided 3 ways between the federal government, bonds covered by toll revenue,
yes, sir,
and by the 2 states. Federal share is fixed. The bond revenue is unlikely to reach projections according to independent experts, which means that all of the cost overrun will likely fall to the 2 states. Because of inverse leverage, this means that if the project cost were to increase 30%, the state share would double. So far, the project is about 270% over the initial cost estimate for design work. The similar project in the Bay Area, rebuilding part of the Bay Bridge, has gone from $2 billion to $6 billion. How can the state of Oregon protect itself from this situation, and should we perhaps be demanding a less costly solution to this problem?
Okay, thank you very much for the question, and I'm going to do my very best to answer it with the knowledge that I have. So the legislature has already passed the bill to build the Columbia River crossing, and they've already passed the bill that commits the state of Oregon to $450 million, and the governor has signed it into law. So that's done as far as the legislative process is concerned. In that process, the legislature asked the Treasury to complete an investment-grade analysis. So look very hard at the entire financing structure of the Columbia River crossing. We're focusing on all 3 parts of that financing model that you suggested. We're looking at the federal funding, and I would politely and respectfully disagree with you that those dollars are fixed. I would argue that those dollars are far from certain, and that's a part of the bigger picture about the viability of the project. The second part that we're looking at is the state contribution, and there are provisions that are already built into the legislation and will be built into the bonding commitments in terms of what happens if the costs go over or if additional dollars need to be put in. And it's my expectation that it would be a shared responsibility between the state of Oregon and the state of Washington as the sponsors of that project. The third part is the part where we're probably drilling down the hardest, and that's the question of tolling revenues. You'll recall about 2 years ago, the Treasury was asked to look at the tolling revenue analysis, and to be blunt, it came up seriously lacking. Our projections were about $600 million less than what was built into that report. So we're already working on that investment grade analysis. It'll take us the better part of the rest of the year to complete it. The next waypoint will be sometime at the end of June when our analysts come back with their next level of data and information. Our commitment to you as citizens and taxpayers is that we will be absolutely thorough in how we conduct that analysis, and we're going to be transparent about it. We actually have a place on our website where all of the numbers are going as soon as we get them. You're free to peruse them and come to your own conclusions as we come to ours. And we will report out fully and publicly on everything we conclude with regard to the financing. We're not getting into the structure of the bridge. We're not getting into the aesthetics. We're focusing solely on where our expertise is, which is on the financial plan backing the project.
Unfortunately, we have run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join us next week for our discussion, debate, and vote on the fluoridation of Portland's water supply. And as we close today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to State Treasurer Ted Wheeler. We are adjourned.
Appreciate it. Thank you.